Okay, thank you for joining this presentation on fair housing and resident selection. This is a hot topic, especially as it relates to community land trusts and trying to involve residents in this process as much as possible and making sure that all of us understand the universe of applicable laws and best practices. So I'm going to do an overview of this. And before we start, I just have a couple housekeeping items. First is this disclaimer, so I'll give you a few moments to read through this. Okay, and would like to introduce you to the San Francisco Community Land Trust. SFCLT was formed in 2003 to combat displacement pressures in San Francisco. Today, we own and steward 16 buildings with approximately 180 units of permanently affordable housing for either rent or limited equity cooperative ownership. And we're about ready to add another building to that group. All of our properties are located in San Francisco. And for the past 2 years, we have been lending technical support to other community land trusts and small developers across the 9 county Bay Area, including things like asset management, brokerage, pro forma development support, and other topics. My name is Sarah Scruggs. I am the program director at SFCLT, and I will be walking you through this topic today. Okay, so a map of where we are going. Going to start with looking at fair housing, what it is, some of the applicable laws from the federal, state to the local level, and then a bit of a deep dive on reasonable accommodations as it relates to those with disabilities, laws, examples, and best practices, and then finally resident selection. So making sure we understand lender requirements that may exist, especially from public lenders, some best practices around an affirmative marketing plan strategy, as well as using scored interview questions. So, fair housing, what is it? It is the right to rent or buy a home in any neighborhood. And of course, if you can afford it. Uh, that's a big issue for us. Obviously, if someone can't afford it, then they won't be able to have access to it. But people cannot be discriminated against in the renting and buying of a home based on the things that we'll talk about as far as protected classes and then key things that are considered discriminatory practices. So, when we're talking about applicable law on the federal level, we're going to look mainly at the Federal Fair Housing Act. And on the state of California level, looking at the Fair Housing and Employment Act, the UNRRA Civil Rights Act. We're not going to specifically talk on the local level because it does depend on your county and local jurisdiction. But when it comes to that area of the law, it's usually around local preferences, and I'll discuss that more in the resident selection part of today's presentation. So, the Federal Fair Housing Act, this was signed into law in 1968 as a section of the Civil Rights Act. It is overseen by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, acronym of called HUD. And HUD has the power to investigate and enforce claims of housing discrimination that come their way. When someone is filing a complaint, HUD and the Department of Justice are jointly responsible for enforcing the Federal Fair Housing Act, and they are supposed to look into all complaints. When a complaint is filed with HUD, the household will receive the notice and they can either resolve the complaint through mediation or through going to court. And court specifically can be very costly. And when fair housing the Fair Housing Act is describing discrimination, uh, it's specifically looking at intentional discrimination. So, in which property owners, landlords, or homeowner associations are trying to keep certain people from living where they want. And we will talk about what those people groups are in the next slide here. The Fair Housing Act currently identifies 7 protected groups. So when the law was first passed in 1968, it included race, color, religion, and national origin. And then an amendment was added in 1974 to include sex as a protected group. And then finally in 1988, familial status was added as a protected group, so protecting people with children under 18 years of age, and then also those with disabilities, whether physical or mental. And the prohibited acts that are listed in the Fair Housing Act include it being a violation to refuse to rent or sell housing to someone, refusing to negotiate for housing, making housing unavailable, outright denying a dwelling to someone, the practice of setting different terms, conditions, or privileges for the sale or rental of a dwelling, falsely denying that housing is available for inspection, sale, or rental. It's a violation to engage in blockbusting practices. It's prohibited to deny access to or membership in a facility or service, such as a multiple listing service related to the sale or rental of housing. And then it's also a violation to threaten, coerce, intimidate, or interfere with anyone exercising a fair housing right or assisting others who exercise that right. So these are the ways that the Fair Housing Act sees housing discrimination happen. So going to the state level, let's take a look at California's Fair Employment and Housing Act, which includes the 7 protected classes from the federal law that we talked about earlier, and then it adds additional protected classes, which include a source of income. You can't discriminate against someone based on where they get their income from. Sexual orientation is included as a protected class, marital status, age, specifically those over the age of 40. It's denying somebody housing based on arbitrary characteristics, gender identity, and gender expression, someone's ancestry, that is protected, veteran or military status, and finally, genetic information. And the entity in the state of California that enforces the Fair Employment and Housing Act is the Civil Rights Department. So if there is a complaint that someone wants to file, they would file it with this department. And this act applies to all housing providers, whether or not they are federally funded, with some minor exceptions. And the list of prohibited acts in this state law are long. It includes many of the prohibitions that are in the Federal Fair Housing Act, as well as these below acts. And I want to stress that this is not a comprehensive list. I really encourage everyone after this presentation to look further into these laws, the actual text of them themselves. And there are some really great organizations out there that do a deep dive on fair housing. Uh, so that probably would also be helpful for you. But some of the additional prohibitions, prohibited acts in the state law include the cancellation or termination of a sale or rental agreement, policies, practices, terms, or conditions that result in unequal access to housing related services. Sexual harassment is specifically called out. Harassment involving unwanted sexual advances or requiring sexual favors for housing rights or privileges. The refusal to make reasonable accommodations in housing rules, policies, practices, or services. And we're going to talk about that more specifically in the next section of this presentation. Retaliation against someone filing a complaint, and overly restrictive rules limiting the activities of daily life for families with children, including where children are allowed to play. And the second state law we're going to briefly discuss is the California Unrest Civil Rights Act. This is a more general anti-discrimination law that applies to all business establishments in the state of California, which includes those in the business of housing. And it establishes that at any business, people in protected categories are entitled to the following: full and equal accommodations, advantages, facilities, privileges, and services. And this Civil Rights Act adds a few more protected classes. First is citizenship. You can't discriminate based on someone's citizenship. Immigration status, which is a big deal. That this exists in the state of California. You cannot discriminate based on someone's immigration status. And finally, someone's primary language. All right, so now we are going to do a deep dive into reasonable accommodations, the legal infrastructure for that, some examples and best practices. But first, let's talk about what it is. A reasonable accommodation is a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service that is necessary for a person with a disability to have an equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. And on the federal level, uh, these two pieces of the law are important to know about. So the amendment that was made to the Fair Housing Act in 1988, that establishes that persons with disabilities are a protected class. And it also creates the requirements of reasonable accommodation to procedures. So the fact that you have to, as a housing provider, accept requests for reasonable accommodation. And then the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1991, that expanded the rights of the disabled, especially regarding physical accessibility. And in that law, it creates the requirement of reasonable modification to physical facilities. So how buildings and aspects within people's homes and units could be modified. And here are a list of examples that HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, has. And again, these are not comprehensive, but it just gives you an idea of what a reasonable accommodation request could look like and how it could be addressed. So assigning an accessible parking space to somebody that has mobility issues, permitting someone to transfer to a ground floor unit from a higher floor, adjusting a rent payment schedule to accommodate when someone receives income assistance for their disability, adding a grab bar to someone's bathroom so it's easier for them to move around, permitting an applicant to submit a housing application via different means. And then the final example that I've included here is permitting an assistance animal in a no pets building for someone who is deaf, blind, has seizures, or mental disabilities. And each request for reasonable accommodation should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. You know, the accommodations may include changes that are necessary in order for a person with a disability to use and enjoy a dwelling, like the ones we've discussed above, including public and common use spaces, or to participate in a federally assisted program or activity. And a requested accommodation may be necessary when there is an identifiable relationship or relationship between the requested accommodation and the individual's disability. And finally, some best practices around reasonable accommodation. And you want to make sure that your practices and policies in this area are tight and also clear. So the first suggestion is to use a form response to respond to requests, and making sure in that response that there's an acknowledgement of the request that someone has made around a reasonable accommodation, that you're detailing any needs you have for more information, if it's applicable at that time, including your decision around the reasonable accommodation request and your reason for that decision. And then finally, inviting further dialogue and any questions that people may have. So in addition to having a form response that helps detail all these things so you don't forget what you need to do and include, it's also important to develop a policy for reasonable accommodation that makes it clear what's happening and who's doing what, and answers these 4 questions. So first, who will handle the process of looking at a reasonable accommodation, responding to it, all those things. How fast will you respond, and how long will the process take? Who will be making the final decision around a reasonable accommodation request? And finally, how will you keep records of the requests that you've received, of the responses that you've given to people, and of maybe even potential accommodations that you have made in response to people's requests? And as long as the reasonable accommodation does not pose an undue financial administrative burden, and the request does not constitute a fundamental alteration of the operations of a building or a housing community, the request should be accommodated. It's important to be really mindful about how you go about this process and to obtain legal advice when possible to make sure that you're just doing everything as comprehensively and thoughtfully as possible. Okay, let's jump to our final section on resident selection. And we'll be looking at any requirements from mostly public lenders and some best practices around affirmative marketing plans and scored interview questions. So pay attention to any requirements that are mentioned in your affordable housing loan documents regarding resident selection. There is a wide array of differences across jurisdictions and even within jurisdictions around what is being required of an affordable housing provider or an affordable housing community. And some of the common examples that you will likely see mentioned in those loan documents are referenced. The big one includes lottery processes. So, the process of people submitting applications and then a lottery being run in order to put people in numerical order for you to then process and go through that list from the beginning to the end. And then a whole host of rules around how quickly you respond to people, how you respond to people. So pay attention if that is mentioned in your loan documents. And something else that's commonly mentioned are wait lists. So how you create those wait lists and how you maintain those wait lists over time, including maybe even having to reach out to people once a year on those wait lists to ask if they're still interested. So pay attention to language around that as well. And then finally, as I mentioned briefly when we were talking about applicable laws, on the local level, there are local jurisdictions, counties, towns, and cities that detail local preferences. And oftentimes those are preferences for people that live or work in an area where an affordable housing building, home, or unit is, and giving those people first preference. And then I've also seen sometimes local preferences around people that live within a specific radius of the housing development or the home or unit. So pay attention if those things are listed, and those preferences are often uh, dictated by statute. So local laws have been passed around that process, and you can get more information from the people that work in local housing departments and other applicable departments. Okay, a first best practice around resident selection is creating an affirmative marketing plan. So, an affirmative marketing plan details your efforts to market housing to as wide a range of people as possible in a way that is accessible to those groups. And the goal of such a plan is to establish fair and equitable practices for attracting as diverse as possible a pool of housing applicants and to document those practices. And this is important, number one, for you to get as much traction as possible, as many applicants as possible, and also to make sure that you protect yourself against claims of discrimination. And so the practice of marketing as widely as possible is important in that, and then documenting everything that happens along the way, how you market, how the process is set up, how decisions are made. This is the goal of an affirmative marketing plan. And there are some local jurisdictions that just require this. If you have an affordable housing development that they helped fund, they're going to ask you for one of these. But I do suggest, even if you're not asked for one of these, to set one up. It's helpful, and I'll go over what is often in these marketing plans in the next slide. So, components to include in a plan. The application process itself. So, what are you asking people to fill out? What forms are you asking them to include? Application dates, as much detail as possible. Detailing how you are complying with fair housing laws on a federal, state, and local level. And being really clear about what the eligibility requirements are for someone applying for this housing development unit or home. So, are there any maximum income requirements, maximum household size requirements, anything in regards to credit, or just anything that are around eligibility, and who they can reach out to if they have questions about that as well. And then the marketing plan itself. So, how are you getting out the word? Putting that into writing, all the different ways that you are marketing your housing community, your housing development. And then finally, how you are making the final selection for someone to rent or buy a home. And being real clear about where people can go and who they can contact if they have questions about that selection process or if they have complaints about the selection process. And finally, here are some marketing examples to again make sure that your marketing plan is affirmative, that you are reaching as many diverse groups and places as possible. So, a suggestion to include written announcements in local newspapers or other local means of media that make sense. Posting and emailing flyers to several community-based organizations, community centers, places where different people congregate and go to. And if possible, posting your marketing materials in a few languages. So you do have to be careful that if you are marketing in a particular language, that you also are prepared to offer the application and other documents in those same languages. So make sure that you're prepared for that. And then a final example is making accommodations for visually or hearing impaired folks in how you market and accept applications. Okay, the final best practice that I wanted to talk about today includes using scored interview questions as part of selecting someone to rent or purchase a home. And I've seen these interviews most often used as part of resident selection for limited equity cooperatives or condo associations. It's a way for the applicants themselves to get to know what's important to a housing community, which is raised up in the questions that are asked, and also for those that are part of the the selection committee to also get to hear about this person that is applying to live in the housing community. But it can also be used for rentals and maybe even for single family homes. You just want to make sure that there's nothing, again, in an affordable housing loan document or local law that prohibits this being used. Score interviews, they rate each applicant's answer to preset questions on a numerical scale. So you asking someone a question and you're rating it from 1 to 5. And then you take the sum of the ratings across all of the questions that you have, and that gives a set score. And that final score is what will help the selection committee make the final decision on who is the finalist for this unit, this home. And the goals of this process are to, number one, help eliminate discrimination and bias from your selection process. This whole process, fair housing lawyers get really nervous that it's just fraught with potential bias and discrimination. So by having a preset set of questions and by scoring them and making sure those questions are specific to the housing community and what it takes to be a member of that housing community, which we'll talk about next, that eliminates as much bias and discrimination as possible in this process. And this is an acceptable practice for co-ops and other housing communities in places like San Francisco and Oakland and Berkeley and other places that I've worked. And then finally, a second goal of this process is to create documentation of your selection process to, again, make sure that you're protecting yourself against lawsuits. And also so that you have a record of what's been done in the past, decisions that have been made, and so that you can improve your process in the future. So finally, some tips for the interview questions themselves. You want to make sure that you ask the same questions of every single housing applicant. You don't want to ask any questions directly related to the protected classes of people. So you want to make sure that is not included in your list of questions. And we can actually provide examples of interview questions that have been reviewed by fair housing lawyers and accepted by housing departments across the Bay Area. And you want to make sure in the process that you're only asking minor clarifying questions. So not going completely off topic, but just making sure that you understand the answer that somebody has given to a particular question. And the questions themselves are there to make sure that you're careful about not allowing friendships to affect the interviewing of an applicant. So you're asking the same questions to somebody who may be the friend of somebody that lives at the housing as you are to someone who is unknown. And then finally, the questions themselves, like I mentioned before, they need to relate to the housing community's value and mission, as well as be in relationship to what it means to be a successful participant in the housing community. And this is a way, again, for you to get to know the people who are applying to live in your housing community, as well as for them to get to know you as well. It'll be really revealing for them what questions you ask. And again, happy to provide any examples of interview questions. This is a really involved process. Again, can be really fraught with possible discrimination, but these best practices around formative marketing plans and then also scored interview questions have been reviewed by fair housing lawyers and really help to eliminate as much bias and discrimination as possible when it comes to housing selection. And also, especially with the interview, well, both. With an affirmative marketing plan, you want to get as many applicants into your pool as possible so that you can find people that are really going to be interested in being a part of your housing community, that really like want to live in a place that values certain things, that has a mission about certain things, that isn't, participates in certain ways. So the marketing is just as important as the interview process itself. So the questions that you ask on the end to finalists. So it's an important way, again, for you to have some power in the selection of people that are going to live with you, but also making sure that that power is not abused, and that it's a clear process for the people that are a part of the selection process, and then also for those that are applying to be a part of that housing community. So thank you so much for listening to this presentation on fair housing and resident selection. There's always more to talk about, so please do not hesitate to reach out to me with questions. And again, thank you so much.